There was very good questions earlier on, and I have to say, Meredith, it was music to my ears. Preparing, in fact, launching and diving into social media is not easy. Many times, of course, people think that, okay, we're going to have a Facebook page and we're going to have a Twitter account, and here we go, we're in social media. Next, eventually, people will say, I'll take a student and we'll go and do community management. I think that this is kind of like all wrong steps. I'm not going to go and tell you about social media strategy today. I'm going to go and tell you what you can drive from the conversation that people are saying. Everyone here might eventually go and check in on Foursquare. Everyone eventually will go and use the actual Twitter handle and says, Patrick says that, or Meredith says that, etc., etc. Or eventually you'll go to a restaurant and says, oh, the food is shit. I don't like this restaurant. So we're leaving every day lots of traces. So let's go and try to understand social data. Who knows what is social data? Any guess? What do you consider as social media data? So it's post, okay, this is data. Pictures, this is data as well. Forums, forums is a platform. Polls, okay, responding to polls. You have different type of social data, and it means different things. It can mean CRM, it can mean Facebook statistics, it can mean Twitter followers, numbers, volumes. But the vast majority of this content is created secondhand. That means you have lots of tools, and we talked about it earlier on about Radian 6, about Socialize, about Sysomos. All these actual tools collect information, collect data from Facebook, from Twitter, from forums, whatever is public. Whatever is not public cannot be collected. Earlier on, I think the lady was asking, you know, how can you kind of collect Arabic content? And we know that in this region, forums are used a lot. If the forum is not public, you will not be able to go and see those conversations. And most of these actual tools aggregate, analyze by volume. But in fact, there is something like this. This is in fact basically a report that you get from a Radian 6. This is basically what you get from some agencies. It will tell you that you have that many mentions for your brand this week, that many mentions on Twitter last month, that many kind of like likes, sentiment analysis, which is positive or negative. But this is not insights. This is not data. This is just volume. It tells you that, okay, my mention has been said 20 times this week. Is 20 good or 20 is bad? Well, if you're a startup like the actual guy earlier on, but probably 20 during the week is very good. But if you are Coca-Cola, 20 is very bad. So what is good and what is bad? And eventually it could be 20 nonsense, saying kind of like Pepsi is cool. Okay, fine, 20 times. Okay, fine, everyone knows Pepsi is cool and Pepsi advertising is cool. But Pepsi might eventually give you cancer. That is very bad. And that has an insight, and you have to understand who said that and why he's saying it and where the source, and if there is something kind of like behind it. So the raw data is the good stuff. This is where, in fact, the raw content is created. It's created by people, and it's about people. And this is what is important. Any company and any marketing, social media is not new. Social media is just platforms that is happening online, and it's about people. People are sharing content. People are sharing their opinion peer-to-peer, and that is lateral and vertical and bilateral, between authority being company and between peers, which in fact is peer-to-peer. And that is the beauty about social media. It's people, it's spontaneous conversation. No one is asking you, like in a survey, what do you think about X, Y, Z? And therefore you have the time to think, and within the actual context, whether you are pressured, whether you are in mad mood because your wife kind of like made you kind of like mad this morning, and therefore you're going to answer something which is different than the next day if you are eventually in good mood. So anyhow, raw content that is created by people and the content about people is the most important thing. And if you look at the Journal of Advertising Research, they said that today and tomorrow, especially by the 2015-2020, marketeers and market research will be going and fishing information from this actual river of information. All this actual data. If you search sometime about social media data, you'll find lots of articles talking about big data, which means what? We're leaving data everywhere. whether with your credit card, whether when you log in. How many login and password do you have today? Well, probably 10 years ago, we had only one, which was in fact probably Gmail when it started, or Hotmail. Today, how many Gmails? Can you kind of like count? How many passwords do you have? Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, count them. You have minimum 20. It's impossible. And on all this actual network, you might eventually leave one comment, one conversation, you might eventually leave a photo, vacation, or today at a forum, or today at a conference. So this actual river of information is really a reservoir for consumer behavior, consumer perceptions. And despite today's limitations in terms of not everyone is on social media. If I take my parents, they're not on social media, but they are still consumers. And those are still customers. They're still kind of like going and buying products and services from Oyo 30 Business, for example. So not everyone is there. But despite this actual limitation, the market research and the social media listening and monitoring is still important. You might eventually not find, like in the example I gave, lots of conversation regarding slice bread. But you might eventually find lots of conversation about how people love bread, how people love croissant, or how they eat bread, with what they eat bread, whether bread is good or bread is fat or what have you. And therefore you might eventually do your market research around that. And you have three only basic types of information that social media data can contribute. You have in fact the content, what people are saying. And again, it's not what content is being shared to start with, it's what people are saying. Social media is not platforms. Social media is people. That's what kind of like is the difference between the web 1.0, as some people call it, and the 2.0. The web 1.0 made content available everywhere, and you can kind of like download it and eventually kind of like share it. The difference between the two is that web 2.0 is about people, and that's what's important. And this is what is changing the old market research from the new market research, and this is why you can get kind of like insight from those conversations. It's people talking to people. When you are on Facebook, you're not talking to a brand. You talk to your friends most of the time. Yes, you like brands, but you like brands eventually because there's a campaign, because you have an iPad, because you have eventually to win a ticket, or sometime you engage with the brand because you're a fan of the brand and there's something that kind of like happened badly. And this is kind of like the conversation where the brand needs to listen, needs to monitor to try to understand why you're interacting like that with the brand, what you are saying. The second thing that you have to go and monitor, and the second thing where you can drive insight from, is activity. What people do on social network. How do they behave? When you go and take a train, when you go and take you go to the airport and take a plane, how do you behave with your airline company? If every day you go and take Emirates when you're flying for business and it's late, or in fact you went to the counter, the business kind of like counter, and you have plenty of line and it's kind of like it's a mess, etc. The first reaction you do today, the first reaction is just like fail, fail, fail. If this actual company is not listening to you, next time if someone comes to you and says, well, fly with Qatar Airways instead of Emirates, you might eventually go and take Qatar Airways, even if it's eventually more expensive, if they give you some loyalty, if they give you some service. So the activity of how people behave is something, the consumer behavior is something which is very important for market research and for you to be able to engage on social media. And the third is people, understand groups and how they interact and influence each other. When you are buyers, if I come here and it's my first time in Dubai, it's not, but let's say it's my first time, and I'll go and kind of like buy an apartment. I'll go and ask my friends or my colleagues. I'm not going to go and ask an authority. If my colleague says, no, 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 take in the media city, don't take in this actual area. This one is kind of like very good. You have plenty of restaurant, you have plenty of good life, etc., plenty of sport, whatever. I'll trust him. An authority is not going to be trustful. So the way I'm going to behave, the way I'm going to interact, the way I'm going to go and do conversation on a specific subject as a consumer is important to the brand, is important to the company. Plus, the client need is changing. And social media is transforming this actual practice of consumer insight. Why? As we talk, because there's these evolved consumers. And the vast majority of social media research just focus on aggregating those metrics. They're not aggregating social insight. They're not aggregating intelligence. They're aggregating numbers and just data and volume. And this is not, for me, insights. And for the first time, when you kind of like talk about a small market, company do a focus group with 15 people, with 30 people, it's nothing. When you have eventually, 85 million on Facebook, when you take, for example, KSA, you have 5 million on Facebook. I don't know how much in the UAE there is, but there is plenty, kind of like of millions of people on Facebook. That is massive conversation. That is massive kind of like focus group that you can kind of like talk and interact with. So we're not talking about a small group. And social data is a reservoir of opinions, attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors from which insight can be drawn. When you have those insights, this is what enables you to better understand your customers, your consumers, and therefore, this is how you can engage in social media better and wiser. Great insight drives great strategy, drives great campaigns, that drives return on investment. Most of the people don't go into this actual methodology. They start with the tactics, then think, okay, how I'm going to go and now do about it? How am I going to go and kind of like keep on my fans? What is in fact the next thing I have to go and sell to my fans? Okay, you have 100,000 fans on your Facebook page. What next? What's next? 150,000? And what is? What is the actual bottom line? What are you getting from these actual fans? At the end of the day, any CEO, any CFO, any COO, any company, the bottom line that we need to go and sell. And you're not going to go and sell the same way on social media channels that you sell eventually on billboards. But still, you need to go and get this insight. And if you know what your consumers are interested in, this is where you can eventually give them the right strategy and the right interaction. So an insight definition is basically a new understanding of an attitude, behavior, need, or frustration that had previously gone unacknowledged, and if acted upon, that means if you act upon this actual insight, it will bring you direct value to brand or business growth. And again, in this actual sentence, I didn't talk about Facebook, I didn't talk about Twitter. I'm talking about your business. This is where, in fact, it's important. Facebook and Twitter is a platform that allows you to access to those actual consumers, not to market to them, but to go and do a dialogue with them. The insight value is that more you kind of like, insight has the findings that you have has to go and give you financial return. The financial return is basically if I know what my consumer wants, I might eventually drive the right message. I'll give you one example of IBM. IBM have done a monitoring of all the actual IT directors, IT managers, of how they are interacting on Google and on social media regarding a specific product within IT. And they find out that they are using always the same 10 keywords to do the research, the same 10 keywords to be able to go and talk about it. They have done then after that content on YouTube of 3 minutes using only these actual 10 keywords in their messaging, in their key messages, and explaining their product and services. And therefore, they kind of like targeted the consumers exactly, and therefore their customer, their IT manager, exactly the way they are searching, or the way they are interacting, or the way they are talking about their product and services. And that brings value, because the actual revenue then after that for that product have increased of 30%, okay, since they kind of like did this actual campaign. And insight, you have to position, in fact, a conversation into, okay, its context. So there are 4 elements to consider in analyzing consumer insight. The first one is the essence, is the surprise, is the identity. The second is the context, where it's happening. If you say, for example, my flight is delayed and it's shit, if you're sitting at home, it doesn't make sense. If you're sitting at the airport, it has a context. What is the context? Is there a flood? Therefore, okay, there's a force majeure. If, in fact, the service is very bad, because this is not the first time, the context is good, and therefore you are a complainer, and your complaint has to go and be taken into account. So the context is something which is important to go and take into account. And the relevance, is there a challenge? And the implication, the ideas and action. This is kind of like an insight criteria checklist. From an essence is, did it give you a eureka moment? Yes, this is kind of like, what I'm searching for. Or does it express a human condition? Does it create an emotional connection? If you take, for example, the context, does it demonstrate a deeper understanding? Does it explain cause and effect? Is it both specific and bold? if you take the relevance part, is it a new way of seeing or doing things? Is it relevant for the consumer? And the implication, does it have a business value? Does it inspire you? This is in fact things which in fact are important, when you're kind of like going to go and bring social media insights. Now, people ask me, how can you use social media insights and where you use it? People think it's only research and marketing, and it's wrong. It's in crisis management. And crisis management is probably, the most common use of social media insights in business at the moment. Okay? If you analyze the conversation and understand the key themes, what people are saying negative, what are they saying negative? Is it because you don't respond? Is it because you're always late? Is it because you never kind of like thank people? And you know that most of the time, when you're angry and someone says, I'm sorry, you calm down. So it's basic customer service. And in social media, people forget. And I remember at one of the conferences, someone asked me, do I have to answer every kind of like complaint on social media? I say, well, if all those customers will call your office, will you answer the phone at every time? I says, I answered. Because if social media is a telephone, do the same thing. Answer to your clients. It's another way. Just don't launch Facebook and Twitter just to push your message without taking the conversation. Conversation is two ways. So the phone is exactly the same thing, and social media is exactly the same thing. So crisis management is somehow where you can do research, where you can kind of like analyze what people are saying so you can have a better customer service. Social media strategy is typical. Earlier on we had a question, how can I go and convince my CEO? Well, do your research about your industry. Do your research about competitors. Do your research about your consumers. What do they want? Where are they? Or if you're going and launch a new product, okay, where this actual audience is. So, and this is where you can get insight. What, in fact, how do they kind of like use, social media, and what do they say about such a product? A quick example, Honda Motor Europe is one of our clients. Honda, when they wanted to go and launch their new Civic in 2012, Starcom, the actual agency, advertising agency, came and says, can you kind of like tell us how people are talking in 5 European markets about the Civic? So we went kind of like and listened and monitored all this conversation over a period of time, and we kind of like take two things. One is the key words and the key messages, 10 key messages that people are saying about Honda Civic specifically. And that's what they used to then after that build their advertising campaign. So instead of brainstorming and thinking, creatively in a room alone, that you know everything about the consumer, how the consumer is talking about your product. Another way of doing it is crowdsourcing, but that's kind of like where, in fact, insights can be brought for your social media strategy. Brand reputation as well is something which is important. Tracking conversation on an ongoing basis. Just don't do brand reputation when you have a crisis. Just keep on going on. Why? Because consumer behavior is changing. Why? Because she might eventually tell me something about kind of like Emirates, in my example, that might eventually change my opinion about Emirates. Where I was not a loyal customer, I might eventually become a loyal customer. So you might eventually see new people coming, you might eventually see new conversation happening, and if you're launching a new product or a new service or you're doing something, you might eventually see if that is affecting positively or negatively your brand. So don't act only from a crisis communication. The customer experience is something which is very important as well. I talked about it earlier on. Customer service, what complaining consumers want from brands when commencing on social media. This is a study that has been done end of 2011. And you can see 76% they want an apology. So if you just kind of like say sorry, 76% will be happy. So it's kind of like, it's as simple as that. But you have to have the resources to be able to answer, and you have to have the resources to answer in real time, not 2 weeks after. You cannot wait for your legal department to go and say, sorry, you cannot put the dot here, you have to go and put it here. It has to be immediate. R&D as well, research and development, you can do a lot. Okay, that was kind of like a very quick video to go and tell you how a company, okay, have set up what they call a mission room. Okay, basically they have monitored not only social media, but any digital thing or anything they have out there. In your business, social media is not a silo. Social media has to be integrated into your kind of like business as a whole. And this is something which, in fact, in doing market research, it's not only one source, it's different sources. So you don't go and like monitor only Facebook. You go and see what's happening on Facebook, what happened on forums. And the context eventually is different from one to the other, to one channel to the other. Twitter is 140 characters. On website, on forums is different. So you have to go and take into account your whole digital matrix, your whole digital conversations, and that will make the actual difference. This is a second example, which is from First Capital Connect, which is in fact is a train company in the UK. And their strategic goal was to become the most customer-centric train operator in the UK. And this is kind of like, I'm not going to go through the detail, but basically the idea behind it and the actual insight and the audit that we have done is that improve the information flows by listening to and enabling customers. I'm not going to go into that. You'll have possibility to go and download the presentation, but basically we have used our model, which in fact is, one, is what is in fact the essence, the effect. Two, is what is in fact is the context, the cause. Three, what is the relevance and what is the implication model. And this is kind of like the potential solution that we have suggested and recommended to this actual company. Basically, you have the sources, online comment, logistical data, update from staffs. And basically what we told them is that you have to go and create a Twitter hub. In the UK, you have lots of Twitter users, lots of twipples, and everyone is complaining on a daily basis that trains are delayed, etc., etc. But most importantly, as I said, remember the customer experience, people want an apology, or at least they want to be informed. So we said the first thing is create in the headquarters a Twitter wall, a Twitter fall, where you can see all the tweets happening, like the mission control that I talked about earlier on. Then the second thing is that fast, consistent information to the web, to the staff, on platforms, on trains, on Twitter accounts. So people have those information, not in one area, but on different areas. Remember, not all consumers, are Twitter addicts. My parents are not Twitter addicts. They don't even know what is Twitter. The second thing is that feed into wider communication strategy. That means don't only communicate, about the information, put it into full communication strategy that helps your company, that helps your brand, and have this actual feedback loop. That means listen as well to whatever people are saying in order to go and integrate it into your kind of like business. And then after that, integrate into new product development, into your R&D for customer staff-driven innovations. I have 5 minutes. I'll skip this one. This is my conclusions, so I can leave you with questions. So the conclusion is basically clients' insights needs are changing. You cannot continue to do market research just the way you used to do it before. You have massive population, massive conversation, massive data, which in fact you can tap into it. This is the river information. Go and fish and take those information, listen to it, monitor, and you will get lots of insights. Social media data streams and disciplines are beginning to transform the research insight category. But something to remind yourself, any approach needs to be validated against established traditional methods. Any tool will not do it for you. You still need to have an analyst. You still need to have a researcher. You still need to have a human person behind those conversations. As Meredith was saying earlier on, if you don't read the context, if you don't put it into the relevance of what the person is saying, why he's saying it, it doesn't make sense. So if I say Coca-Cola is shit, but I'm joking because I'm joking with a friend and you take it out of context, it can be taken as negative. But if I'm just kind of like saying it just like that as a joke, I'm not saying that I'm a believer of Coca-Cola is shit. It makes something else. And the social media research is about integration, not replacement of client existing approach and techniques. So if you have your own methodology of approach, your own methodology of research, integrate social media. Don't replace your methodology with something else. Thank you. And again, I'm spinning off from Ninety10 Group, launching Social Force. This is the new company. It's the same team that I have in Paris, in Riyadh, in Jeddah, and soon in Dubai and Doha. And in Beirut, of course, we are already existing. Thank you. And we are a social media business consultancy, and we operate on the brands, on the engage, on the research, and on the change. Credentials, we work with people like Ministry of Commerce Industry, Ministry of Labor in KSA, people like Zata Rosette in Beirut, like Silcor, like Biblos Bank, and many others. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much, Mr. Patrick. Yes, sir.
Hi, this is Samer from Department of Transport, Abu Dhabi. I actually have two questions. First of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation. You were talking about the integration of social media into the general media strategy. The question is about the authenticity of the content when it comes to social media versus the traditional rules of public relations. There are things that you can say and things you cannot say when you're talking to the media. However, when you're dealing with social media, it's an open space. You have almost no limitations. How do you overcome this obstacle?
If I understood well, that means that do you kind of like accept every comment? I mean, social media, you need to be transparent. You have to go and accept, you know, the comments of everyone. That doesn't mean, sorry, how do you respond? Okay. How do you respond? You have different ways of responding, depending whether, in fact, you have to have moderation. That means if it's, depends where, in fact, let me recap. If the actual comment is happening on your digital properties, being your blog, being your Facebook, being your Twitter, you have to have two things. One is moderation, and secondly, you have to go and decide of the response. The moderation is, one, is it kind of like within your charter? What we do with our clients, we tell them do a community manifesto. Basically, is your charter between yourself and your consumer, your fans, your followers. This is what you accept, and this is what you don't accept. So if you don't accept people talking badly about your CEO, talking badly about your brand, swearing, what have you, etc., you can go and delete the comment you don't kind of like, because it is in your charter, it has been kind of like communicated, it's very, very clear. Now, if it's kind of like a complaint from a client, and how you're going to respond, there's two ways. Are you in crisis or you're not in crisis? If you're in crisis, that means there's a Twitter fall, and you have kind of like tons and tons of kind of like, you know, complaints. Very quickly, you have to go and have a crisis management process. Crisis management process is one, you have already prepared yourself of responses. You respond to start with something which we took into account your kind of like complaints. We'll come back to you and you tell them in how much time, 1 hour, 2 hours, and you come back in 1 or 2 hours. That will like take you the time to go back to whatever authority internally within the company where you have put in place to go and respond to this. Whether it's legal department, whether it's HR, whether it's product, whether it is CEO, whether it is a ministry, whatever it is, you take this actual response and you come back and respond to it. If the buzz negative continue, most importantly, try to go and create a forum where in fact you deviate in fact the conversation from your main target to this actual forum. And most importantly, I always say to people, ask the actual consumer or ask the customer or ask your fan and followers what you have done in our place. Because you're turning the negative into positive. You're asking to resolve the problem. You're telling them, please talk and speak up. Give us suggestions. Most of the time that will kind of like decrease the tension. And most important is once the actual buzz is finished, the negative buzz is finished, read those conversations, take the insights so you can learn and you can then after that readjust your crisis communication, okay, and put it back into your communication channels to make sure that, and report, that means tell your consumers or your customers, we have done something wrong, we'll listen, this is in fact the steps that we have taken, this is the mistakes that we have done, and now we can continue and do our business as usual.
Allow me just to add one thing. I mean, he's talking about how do you respond, and it's an open space, and if it's on your own space, whether it's a Facebook page, you may be able to have that kind of moderation control. But if it's something like on Twitter, well, think of it like this. Every consumer you have has a mic on and loudspeaker. Whether you want to listen to it or not, that's your business. They will speak. They will say what they want, and you just only have an opportunity to respond. Now, whether you want to respond or not, that's a different story, and this is where agencies like Social Force would come in and advise you on how to deal with it. But it's happening, so it's not a question of what do I do. Well, it is happening.
I mean, you can always, I mean, I talked about your digital properties. When it's happening on forums, when it's happening elsewhere, we had that, for example, when the Ministry of Labor in Saudi Arabia has launched Hafiz. Hafiz is like the unemployment, the 2,000 riyal that the government will give you if you are unemployed. it has been very, very negative. Okay. Now we have decided and we have suggested and recommended, and they have been doing it, that there's Khabir Hafiz, which is expert Hafiz, that will go into the forums as such, not kind of like hidden behind a pseudo, and respond. But that is a political decision that has been taken by the owner of, or the clients, in that case the minister, to go and kind of like go ahead and speak up. But that has to have preparations, because you cannot kind of like respond as a community manager. Community manager might eventually not have enough expertise. Those messages on the forums, not on the actual digital project, were prepared by the PR department, who in fact have the skill set to respond to journalists, to respond to crises like that, and will kind of like come up into short responses, and always, as much as possible, drive them back to your digital properties. So you can control the message, and you kind of like have, not to control it, to go and control it into one space, so the dialogue is happening, and it's not kind of like going everywhere.
Thank you. Any other questions? We'll take one.
What are the legal boundaries on Facebook, on the social media in general? Would it be social, religious, or political? If somebody gives his opinion on Facebook within his network, and is he liable legally?
Well, it depends of the country. It depends of what he's saying, and depends of the guidelines and the policies, you know, of the company. If it's happening, for example, if I work for a social force and I'm an employee, and my guidelines and policies will not allow me to be able to go into any kind of like Facebook and talk about my company, my products, my service, and saying that my CEO is shit or my colleague is shit or what have you, etc., I can be fired, because it is in the actual guidelines and policies, and the company has made it very clear to kind of like the employees. If it's a Facebook page, I talked about the community manifesto, which is a charter. That is still the case. If in fact you're not doing something right and you kind of like are doing defamation to the company, you can attack it. You can attack this actual person for defamation. Exactly the same way if he does it into a kind of like into a newspaper. So the same laws will apply, but it will kind of like apply locally. Now, when it happens on properties or on the web, which in fact no boundaries, it's very difficult kind of like to stop. And we saw how it happens into kind of like some of the actual countries, neighbor countries, or in other kind of like type of the world in terms of Nestle. For example, Nestle has been attacked by Greenpeace, saying that, for example, Kit Kat was using palm oil. And they had to go and close, in fact, their page, and that cost them $10 million. So there are certain things which you can stop, and there are certain things that you cannot stop. If you are doing mistakes, if you're not serving your clients, you cannot stop the client today of complaining, and you have to go and take the heat, and you have to adjust your product and services and move forward. However, there's kind of like rules and regulations and policies and guidelines that you can kind of like follow, that you can kind of like you know, publish. And I kind of like say to the companies, don't go like that on Facebook without doing your homework, one internally and two externally. And you have to go and take those two stakeholders into account, because it is important.
Yeah, we're out of time. Do you want to take one more question? I'll take one question.
Thank you for the presentation. One of the takeouts that I have from what I've seen out of your presentation is that we need to go beyond just the data and look at perhaps the more qualitative aspect of the fans. And what I want to know is that, are there any perhaps proprietary tools or tools at all that give us any cultural insights? Because what we all have today as competing brands is perhaps the same data, which is based on age, gender, education, income brackets.
The best tool is the human person. There's no tools, there's no one tool. I'll let you finish, sorry, go ahead.
Then the question is, if it is the human tool, then isn't the qualitative assessment very subjective?
No, if it's being done by a specific team, which are not the community manager. Community manager is here to engage. Community manager is, by the way, when he comes to the office, he should have the smile, and he wants to kind of like engage with the community. He's a fun guy, he knows to engage, he's not someone who's serious. You need to have an analyst who likes the details, who likes to go into the actual bits and pieces, and that he does that as a job. This is his job. Now, there's two ways and there's two schools. There's a school where we can sell, and this is what we do. That means, for example, for the Ministry of Labor, as an example I gave earlier on, the community management, we have done it for 6 months, and we kind of like build, operate, and transfer. We transfer that, in fact, then after that, with their own teams. But the analysis, we kept it. Why? Because we still have these, how can I say, we're not involved, and therefore we don't have this subjectivity that if you are involved internally with your brand, you say, no, this is not true. We are more objective because we don't care. We are going to go and give them the insight as we see them, as we analyze kind of like the data. So you have the other school which says, in fact, is, yes, I can have my own team, but the team is, in your case, will be centralized, will not be decentralized. And therefore, it's at the corporate level. It's like, for example, financial consolidation on a holding, okay, it's not being done locally, it's being done there. You have a CFO who, in fact, is going to go and do it. And here it's exactly the same thing. You need a counterbalance between a community manager and someone who's going to do your research and insights. And you don't have the same boss. You don't have the marketing that is going to go and run it. You might eventually have kind of like the R&D who's going to go and run it. Now, of course, these for big companies. For smaller companies, you might eventually have 2 people, or you might eventually have agency. But there is no tool. You have multiple of tools that you can use. You can use the Sysomos, you can use the Region 6, you can use Google. Google is very good. You have social mentions, you have cloud for the influence, you have many things. But at the end of the day, it's the use of all these tools that you have to go and put. But first thing, what is your objectives? What is your KPIs? Then after that, you measure. But first, you have to set your objectives. So you can set your KPIs, so you can then after that measure, and you can kind of like do the reports. And when you measure, you have 2 measures. You have the data at the dashboard, and you have as well the insights. And it's 2 different sets. For your CEO and your CFO or your marketing, he wants to eventually see if we are yes or no taking voice of share. And for eventually the marketeers, they might eventually have the insight to go and do a better product or do a better campaign or do whatever else. So you have different sets of KPIs and different sets of data that is being used within the actual company.
Thank you very much, Mr. Patrick Attallah.